And good evening. I think we're all ready. Good evening. Happy trails to you. I hope you've all been enjoying your day today. And especially want to wish everybody in the American sector here happy Mother's Day. We were fortunate enough to be able to see my mother and my father, and two of my brothers and one of my sisters-in-law. So that is a great pleasure, especially since we have not been able to get together with them much at all in the last year or so. So that was a rare pleasure. And I hope for those of you out there that some of you got the chance to do that. And if you didn't get a chance to see parents in person, I hope you thought about them and mothers in particular, and the important role that they play in all of our lives from, well, even before the very beginning, but that's a whole other story. Anyway, so nice to see you all, and a great pleasure to be here with you. I am having a very back and forth kind of day. Obviously, I did the 2 a.m. reading and then got up and did a sound check and did an interview with a bunch of folks at the Comic Con in Prague, Czech Republic, and then got off of doing that and went over to go visit with the family members, and got back from that and grabbed a quick nap, which I desperately needed at that point. And here I am, and here you are. Didn't that work out nice? Anyway, let me quickly say hello to all the folks who are here. There is Jared. Hello, Jared. Jerry! I saw some of your pictures today, Jerry. I just saw them on the Facebook. Some of them were very funny, but they were all lovely. Len. Hello, Len. Evening. Good to see you, too. Good evening, Kelly. Yes, I think Deb had a nice Mother's Day. I'll double check with her, but as far as I know, she did. She got proper Mother's Day greetings from her spawn, and then we went over and saw my mom. And it's not British Mother's Day, and so we didn't do an official thing with my mother-in-law, because I think British Mother's Day is Mothering Sunday, whatever they call it, is later. I think it's in June. I should know these things by now, but with our binational heritage, but I'm not 100%, but we will do something for that as well. Kristen. Hi, Kristen. Good to see you. Nancy. Hello. And Carl. Good to see you too. Medardo. I'm sorry. It sounds like you've had a tough week, but I'm glad you're here with us, and it's good to see you. And Kenneth. Hello, Kenneth. Emily. Good evening to you. Barban, a pleasure, as always. And Jerry made a joke. Margaret. Hello, Margaret. And Ashley. Hi. Thank you. My mother is I consider my mother to be a pretty awesome mom. And she certainly had a big effect on my writing, because she introduced me to a lot of stories when I was young. We were read to, and all kinds of things like that. As a matter of fact, as you'll see in the Dragonbone Chair and those books, Stone of Farewell to Green Angel Tower, I think they're all dedicated to my mom, and that was a pretty early process, so that was an important dedication. Claudia, good evening. Rook, lovely to see you, however briefly, and hope you're well. And yeah, that's basically it. Good to see you, however briefly, and I hope things are going well for you, and we will check in later on. Dina, hello, greetings from Mexico. Well, greetings back to Mexico, with my sincere pleasure. Con mi placer. God, I can't remember the word I'm looking for. Se me olvidó muchísimas palabras de español. And Leah, hello. Okay, good. And all right, I think we've got everybody there. So anyway, so that's what I am doing. Is I am, after a long multicultural, multifamilial day, I am here to read. I'm here to chew gum and read books, and I'm all out of gum. Actually, I don't chew gum anymore, but you get the general idea. We are, as usual, continuing to read from the Shadowmarch. I'm just going to put "the" on the front of everything from now on. the internet, the Shadowmarch. Hi, I am the Tad Williams. I don't know why that just suddenly appeals to me as an idea. But anyway, so that's what we're going to do. I'm not going to bring you all up to date. We're actually making pretty good progress if you look at how much we've read already. I am not going to go through a big long thing. Kendrick, Barrick and Bryony's older brother, has been murdered. Nobody knows how or why, but suspicions have fallen on Shazo, the master of arms, and also Shazo's countryman, who is the envoy who came to ask for Bryony to be sent in marriage to the outlaw, the bandit lord Ludus, in exchange for her kidnapped father. And of course, Bryony is not only dealing with the problems, the horrors of having her father be kidnapped and her brother murdered, but she also has to worry that she's going to be sent off to be the bride of a bandit. And as for everything else, we'll kind of figure it out as we go. So I am just going to jump in and start reading. But just to let you know, in case anybody's following along at home, this is chapter 9, and we have already gone about halfway through the chapter, but we're starting a new section. It will not be easy, Chert told Opal as he finished his soup. We don't have enough men to do a proper job, and the guild may not be able to get any more in time. The funeral is to be in 5 days, so for now we're just throwing rubble down into the very pits where we were going to be working before the prince died. It'll all have to be cleared out again afterward. Who could do such a terrible thing? She said. For a moment, with his mind full of the task, he could not understand what she meant. Do you mean killing the prince? Of course, you old fool. What else? Her cross expression, mostly for effect, softened. That family is under a curse. That's what people were saying in Quarry Square today. The king captured the younger prince a cripple. Now this. And I suppose the children's mother dying, too, though that was years ago. She frowned. But what about the new queen? If something happens to those poor twins, will her baby inherit the throne? Think of that, before it is even born. Fissure and fracture, woman, the twins are still alive. Do you wish to bring something down on them? Never give the idle gods anything to think about. The idea of something happening to the girl Bryony, who had spoken to him just as freely and kindly as though he were a friend or family member, made him fearful in a way that the whole day in the royal tomb had not accomplished. Where's Flint? In his bed. He was tired. Chert got up and walked into the sleeping room, where Flint's straw pallet now lay at the foot of their own bed. The boy hurriedly shoved something under the rolled shirt which he used to cushion his head. What's that? What have you got, lad? An ordinary child would probably have denied everything, Chert thought as he bent down, but Flint only watched with a certain hooded intent as he reached under the shirt and his hand closed around a confusing combination of shapes. Lifted out and held in the light of the lamp, he saw that they were two separate objects. A small black sack on a cord, which looked a bit familiar, and a lump of translucent grayish-white stone. What is this? He asked, holding up the sack. Whatever it held so snugly was hard and almost as heavy as stone. The top of the bag was sewed shut, but the threadwork on the rest of it was intricate and beautiful. Where did you find this, boy? He didn't, said Opal in the doorway. He was wearing it when we found him. It's his, Chert. What's in it? I don't know. It isn't ours to open, and he hasn't wanted to. But this could have, I don't know, perhaps something in it telling of his real parents. A piece of jewelry with his family name on it, perhaps. Or a costly heirloom that might help pay for his room and board, Chert could not help thinking. It is his, said Opal again, quietly. She knelt beside the boy and stroked his pale hair, and Chert suddenly understood that she didn't necessarily want to find out the boy's true name, his parents' name. "Well," he began, looking at the sack, but now his attention was caught by the stone. What he had first thought was only a sedimentary lump polished by rain or sea, or perhaps even just a weathered piece of pottery, was something much stranger. It was a stone, that seemed clear, but as he stared at it, he realized it was of a kind he had never seen before, nor could he even recognize where it fit in the family of stones and metals. A Thunderling not recognizing a stone's family was something like a dairy farmer stumbling across not just a new breed of cow, but one that could fly. "Look at this," he said to Opal. "Can you make anything of it?" "Cloud chip?" she suggested, meaning an obscure kind of crystal. "Earth ice?" He shook his head. "No, it's neither of those. Flint, where did you find this? Where did you find this stone, boy?" "In the garden place, outside where you were digging." The boy stuck out his hand. "Give them back." Chert glanced from the boy to the bag on a cord, the mysterious, sewn-shut bag. He handed it back to Flint, but hung on to the murky crystal. He and Opal would need to talk about this mysterious legacy, but there was no sense worrying about everything at once. "I'm going to take this stone," he told the child, "not to keep, but because I've never seen anything like it, and I want to see if someone can tell me what it is." He looked at the boy, who stared back expectantly. It took Chert a moment to understand why. "If I may, that is," he said. "You found it, after all." The boy nodded, satisfied. As Chert and Opal went out, Flint rolled onto his back, staring at the ceiling as he squeezed the little bag between his fingers. Opal returned to her clearing up, but Chert only sat, turning the crystal over and over in his hand. It seemed to have an artificial shape. That was the strange thing. A regularity. It appeared to have been chipped out of some larger piece, but there were no fracture markings. In fact, the edges were quite rounded. And it was definitely, incontrovertibly, something he had not seen before. A dark spot seemed to move in its depths. It troubled him, and the more he thought about it, the more troubled he grew. It seemed like something that could only have come from behind the shadow line. But if so, what was it doing deep inside Shadowmarch Castle? And was it coincidence that the boy found it in the cemetery, only a few hundred steps from the chambers where the Prince Regent was murdered? Or that the boy from beyond the shadow line had been the one who found it? He looked at Opal, who was contentedly darning a hole in the knee of Flint's breeches. He desperately wanted to ask her opinion, but he knew he was going to spend a mostly sleepless night himself, and was reluctant to rob her of what might be her last contented slumber for some time, because a fear was growing in him. What was it that Chavin had said? "Do not doubt that if the shadow line sweeps across us, it will bring with it a dark, dark evil." "Let Opal at least have this night," he decided. "Let her be happy this one night." "You're quiet, Chirp. Are you feeling poorly?" "All is well, my old darling," he said. "Never fear." Chapter 10. Halls of Fire. Invocation. Here is the kingdom. Here are its tears. 2 sticks. Nothing is known about any day that is past. From the Bonefall Oracles. It was always bad in the lands of sleep, but this was worse than the other nights, far worse. The long halls of Shadowmarch were again full of the shadow men, the insubstantial but relentless figures who dripped and flowed like black blood, who eased from the cracks between the stones and then took shape, faceless and whispering. But this night, everywhere they went, flames followed them, blazing up in the wake of their pursuit until it seemed as though the very air would catch fire. Everywhere he went, more of them appeared, oozing up from beneath the flagstones, clotting as they slid or shuffled after him, solidifying into vague man shapes. Eyeless, still they stared, and they called mouthlessly after him, noises of both threat and promise. They followed him, many still joined to their brethren in a near solid mass, and fire came behind them, catching in the tapestries and licking upward toward the ancient ceiling as the faceless men followed his hopeless attempt at flight from room to room, through corridor after corridor. They killed Kendrick! His heart seemed lopsided in his chest. His lungs burned. Room after room was wreathed in flame, but still the dark men swarmed after him. They want to kill me! They want to kill us all! The air was so hot it scorched his nostrils and crackled in his throat, as though the entire palace had become an oven. These phantoms of soot, shadow, and blood had killed his brother, and now they would kill him too, chase him like a wounded deer, and hound him to his death through endless halls of flame. Make him well! Chavin stood slowly. At his feet, the page who crouched beside Barrack's bed dabbed at the prince's brow with a wet cloth. It is not so easy, princess. I don't care. My brother is burning up with fever. Bryony felt the balance inside her tipping dangerously. He is in pain. Chavin shook his head. With all respect, I think not so much, Highness. It is one of the boons of fever. It clouds much of the hurt of the illness and lets the mind float free of the body. Float free? She struggled to control herself, but her finger was trembling as she pointed at her writhing, moaning twin. Look at him! Do you think he is free of anything? The other physician, Brother Okros, cleared his throat. Actually, my lady, we have seen others afflicted this way, but in a few days many have been well again. She turned on this small, diffident man who had come from Eastmarch Academy in the mainland town to consult with Chavin. Okros took a step back as though she might hit him, and for a moment she felt a hysterical sense of pleasure at his fear, at the power of her own anger. Yes? Many? What does that mean? And how long have you all known about this fever plague? Since the ending of the last festival month, Highness. There was a slight squeak in his voice. Okros was a priest, but mostly in name only. A teacher of the sciences who had probably seldom set foot in a Trigon temple since his ordainment. Your brother, your other brother, was informed by the academy when the first group of sufferers began to come to us. But he was killed? Yes. She took a deep breath, but it did not calm her. Yes, that might explain why he hasn't given his time to this issue. Did you plan to wait until everyone else in my family was dead from one thing or another before mentioning this plague to me? Please, princess, said Chavin. Bryony, please. The use of her name caught her for a moment, made her look at the court physician. She couldn't quite read the expression on his round face, but it was clear he was trying to tell her something. I'm making a fool of myself, that is what. She looked around at the servants and guards in Barrack's room, and knew there were more castle folk outside, no doubt with their ears pressed to the door. She blinked against what felt like the beginning of tears. I'm frightening everyone. It is not a plague, Highness, Okros said carefully. Not yet. We have fever seasons like this almost every year. This is simply more severe than most. Just tell me what will happen to my brother. His elements are out of balance, Chavin explained. He is full of fire, at least in a sense. I do not want to insult you with what may seem like old superstitions, but it is hard to explain illness without also explaining how the elements within us correspond to the elements without, in our earth and in our firmament. He rubbed his head wearily. So I will only say that his blood is too heated because the elements are out of balance. Normally, the elements of earth and water already inside him would serve to keep that balance, just as stones ring ablaze and water extinguishes it when necessary. But he is all fire and air at the moment, gusting and burning. Gusting and burning. She looked down in horror at Barrick's dear face, so contorted now and so oblivious. Oh, merciful Zoria, please don't take him from me. Don't leave me alone in this haunted place, please. Many have already survived this fever, Princess, said little brother Okros. We have had news of it from the southern travelers in prior days. It has already been in Cyan and Jelon for months. Perhaps it came in with the ship from Hyrosol, Chavin suggested. He had tugged the page boy away and was examining Barrick again, smelling his breath. Bryony's twin was a little quieter, but he still murmured worriedly in his sleep, his face sparkling with sweat. It doesn't matter, she said. It was the bleak and ruthless will of the gods, the dark wings she had felt spreading above them all. It was her every dire premonition coming true. It doesn't matter where it came from. Just tell me this. How many die from it, and how many live? We hate to make pronouncements of that type, my lady, began the academy physician. Chavin frowned at him. At least half have survived, unless they were babies or old folk. Half? She was on the verge of shrieking again. She closed her eyes and felt the world spinning around her. All had gone mad. All had gone completely mad. And what is the treatment? Open windows, Okros said promptly. Dirt from the temple of Kernios beneath the head and foot of his bed, and wrap him in wet cloths. Water from Erevor's temple basins would be particularly good, and we must make prayers to Erevor, of course, since he is your family's special patron. All this will serve to soothe the influence of fire and air. There are also herbs that might help. As Chavin rubbed at his forehead again, considering, Bryony noticed for the first time that the court physician looked dreadful. His features were pale and sagging, and he carried circles dark as bruises beneath his eyes. Willow bark and tea made from elderflowers might also help bring down the fever. We should bleed him as well, added Okros, glad to be talking about something meaningful. A bit less blood will ease his suffering. Bryony nudged Chavin to one side, none too gently, and with an immense rustling of skirt sank down beside her brother. These clothes keep me trussed like a troublesome horse, she thought as she struggled to find a comfortable position. Or a captured thief. It hurts even to bend. Her brother's eyes were mere slits, but his pupils darted about between the lids. Barrick? It's me, Bryony. Please, can't you hear me? She touched his cheek, then took his hand. Despite its warmth, it was damp as something found in a rock pool. I won't leave you. You must leave him, my lady, said a new voice. Bryony looked up to see Avon Brone standing in the doorway, filling it with his bulk. I beg your pardon, but the truth must be told. There is much to do. Tomorrow we bury the Prince Regent. Tomorrow someone must take up the scepter so that the people can see an Eden still sits the throne. And if Prince Barrick is too ill, then it must be you. And I have other news for you as well. She felt a weird little thrill. So, the only person I can absolutely trust not to send me to Ludus, she realized, will be on that throne. For a moment, she had an image of all the things she might do, all the petty wrongs she could reverse. Then she looked down at Beric again, and the idea of what she might accomplish seemed pointless. "How many are sick with this?" she asked Chavin. "How many have the fever now?" He looked at the physician from the academy. "A few hundred in the town, perhaps." "Is that right, Okrus? And a dozen or so in the castle. 3 of the kitchen servants, I think. Your stepmother's maid, and 2 of Beric's own pages." He patted the head of the little boy who held the wet cloth. "Those are the ones I knew about when your brother began to sicken." "Anissa's maid? But how is Anissa herself?" "Your stepmother is well, and so is the baby she carries." "And none of those who came with that man Dawet had the fever?" Chavin shook his head. "Strange it should be brought on their ship, and yet none of them should sicken." "Yes, but fever is a strange thing," said this pale, battered-looking Chavin, a man who almost seemed a stranger to her. She found herself wondering, for perhaps the first time ever in her life, what he did when he was by himself, what life and thoughts he kept secret from others, as everyone did. It can touch one and leave another standing just beside him unharmed. "Like murder," she said. Bryony was almost the only one in the room who did not make the sign to ward away evil after she had spoken. Even Beric groaned in his fevered sleep. He had run until he was beyond the immediate reach of the faceless shapes, the whisperers, but he knew they were still somewhere behind him, flowing through the honeycombed rooms, sniffing for him like dogs. He was in a wing of the castle he didn't know, chamber after chamber of dusty, unfamiliar objects flung around without order or care. A broken orrery stood on a table, metal arms bent so that they protruded in all directions, like the quills of some spiky creature. Carpets and tapestries were draped across each other, bunched and crumpled at the edges, even spread onto the timbered ceiling so that it was somehow difficult to tell which way was up, and they were beginning to curl with the rising heat. He stopped. Someone, or something, was calling his name. "Beric, where are you?" He realized with a spasm of terror that it was not only the shadow men who were looking for him, the men of smoke and blood, but something else as well. Something tall and dark and singular. Something that had been hunting him a long, long time. His swift walk became a run. Moments later, it became a wild, headlong dash. Still, his own name floated to him like a lonely echo from one benighted mountaintop to another, or like the cry of some lost soul stranded upon the moon. "Beric, come back!" He was in a long corridor, open on one side, he realized, sprinting through a gallery that dropped away next to him, a dizzying plunge to the stone flags just a misstep away. All the castle must be afire now. Here the tapestries were burning at the bottom edges, flames beginning to lick their way up the stylized hunting scenes and representations of adventuring gods and ancient kings seated in glory. "Beric!" He pulled up, heart speeding. The flames were climbing higher, the gallery filling with black smoke. He could feel a baking heat all down his right side that hurt his skin. He wanted to run, but something was moving in the smoke ahead of him, something stained red and orange by leaping firelight. "I am angry, very angry." Beric's heart felt as though it might crack his breastbone. The shape trudged out of the murk, smoke dripping down. The shape trudged out of the murk, smoke dripping down its length like water, fire curling in the dark beard. You shouldn't run from me, boy. His father's stare was dull and empty, cloudy as the eyes of a dead fish in a bucket. Shouldn't run. It makes me angry with you. For all her discontent with her clothing, Bryony was glad for once that Moina and Rose had laced her so tightly, glad that her embroidered stomacher was stiff as armor. It seemed to be all that held her upright on her battered wooden chair, the chair that, at least for this mad moment, had become the throne of all the March kingdoms. Did anyone else feel the same as she did? Did everyone? Were all these castle folk, in their ornate finery, no more than confused souls hiding inside costumes, as the hard shells of snails protected the helpless and naked things that lived within them? He says what? She was frightened again, even if she forced herself not to show it. She fought hard to keep her eyes on the Lord Constable, not to let her glance dart into the shadows in anxious search for the assassins and traitors who had seemed all around her in the terrible hour of Kendrick's death, but whose phantom presences had been mostly absent since Shazo's capture. But we found the bloody knife. Surely you have told him that. What does he claim? He will not tell us anything else. Avenbrone looked almost as tired as Chavin had, his great body sagging. He would clearly have liked to sit down, but Bryony did not call for a stool. He simply says he did not kill your brother or his guards. Pay no attention to this nonsense, Bryony. Galen Tolley's anger seemed genuine, and for once it was not aimed at her. Would an innocent man not tell everything he knew? Shazo is taken by shame, that is all, although I am surprised it could happen with such a villain. But what if he is telling the truth, Duke Galen? Bryony turned back to Bron. Or what if he is not the only murderer? It still seems strange he should kill all three by himself. Not so strange, Highness, suggested the Lord Constable. He is a deadly fighter, and they would not have been prepared. He would have caught them all unsuspecting. He likely stabbed the first guard and set on the second in a mere moment. Once the second guard was killed, he then attacked your unarmed brother. Bryony felt queasy. She couldn't bear to think too deeply about it. About Kendrick, alone, helpless, holding up his arms, perhaps defending himself against a man he had known and trusted all his life. And you still say there is no one else in the castle who could have done it, or even aided Shazo in the murder? I have not said that, my lady. I've said that we cannot find any such person despite our hardest labors, but it is not certain we ever could. Even at night, hundreds are quartered inside this keep. Captain Vanson and his guards have spoken to almost everyone, searched nearly every room, but there are 1,000 more that enter here during the hours of day who might have hidden, then escaped after the murder and the alarm and confusion. Vanson, she snorted, but then anger overcame her. There are not 1,000 in the whole world who would want to kill my brother, but there are some, and I suspect I know many of them. The courtiers stirred nervously, and their whispers became even quieter. Many fewer were in the throne room than usual. Dozens were keeping to their rooms or houses in fear, both of assassins and the fever. 1,000, Lord Brone? That is wordplay. Are you telling me that the simpleton boy who brings the turnips from the Maronswalk wagons might be one of Kendrick's murderers? No, it is someone with something to gain. Brone frowned and cleared his throat. You do me and yourself a disservice, Highness. Of course what you say is true. However, though we must suspect almost everyone, we must insult no one needlessly. Would you have me mew up every noble who might be thought to benefit from the Prince Regent's death, Is that your command?" He looked around the room, and a sudden silence fell. The courtiers looked startled as geese caught in the open by a thunderstorm. A part of her would indeed have liked to see all these idle, overdressed, and overpainted folk made to answer for themselves, but Bryony knew that was just rage and despair. One or two of them might well be guilty, might be part of a conspiracy with Shazo, but the rest would then be blameless and would rightly resent ill treatment. The landowning nobility were not famous for their patience and humility, and if the Eddens did not have the support of the nobility, then the Eddens were nothing. "We've lost Father and Kendrick. I won't lose our throne as well." "Of course I don't want that," she said, measuring her words. "Rough times make for rough jokes, Lord Avon, so I forgive you, but please do not instruct me. I may be green in years, but in my father's absence and my brother Barrick's illness, I am the throne of Southmarch." Something flickered in Brone's eyes, but he bowed his head. "I stand fairly chastised, Highness." Bryony's strength was failing. She badly needed to lie down and sleep. She had not had more than a few unbroken hours of it for several nights. She wanted to see her twin well, and her other brother alive again. Most of all, she wanted her father back, someone who would hold her and protect her. She took a slow, deep breath. It did not matter what she wanted, of course. There would be twisted into something almost unrecognizable, but there was no question who it was. Barrick turned and ran. Smoke and flame swirled around him as though he had tumbled down one of the rooftop chimneys or down a gash in the earth toward the regions of fire. His father came after him, boots echoing on the flags, a fuming Kernios with beard ablaze and voice booming. "Come here, child, you are making me very angry." The downward course of the stairs twisted in a great arc like the limbs of a wind-tortured tree. Did not hesitate. For a moment, back, snagged in his garments, tried to grapple him. "Stop!" And then his feet were out from under him, and he was tumbling down the steps beside the abyss, sliding, flung like a pebble, thumped and rattled down against hard stone until his breath was out of his body and his brains were out of his head. As he fell, the voices of the whispering shadow men became a shout, a roar, and all he could think was, "Not again! Oh, gods, not again!" He woke, shivering and weeping. He did not know where he was or even who he was. A round man with a somber, kindly face bent over him, but for an instant it was that other face that he saw again, that familiar face twisted into a hateful mask and bearded in flame, and he shrieked and struck out. In his weakness, his hand barely twitched. The shriek was a stifled moan. "Rest," the man said. "Chavin." His name was Chavin. "You have a fever, but there are people caring for you." "Fever?" he thought. "It is no fever. The castle was on fire, and they were under attack. Evil flowed inside the walls like poisoned blood in a dying man. Bryony!" He remembered her suddenly, and as if in imitation of their collateral birth, with her name his own came back as well. She has to know. She must be told. He strained again to make a noise, this time to speak. Bryony. She is well, Highness. Drink this. A beautiful coolness was poured into his throat, but he could not immediately remember how to swallow. When he had finished sputtering and coughing, and had taken a little more, Javen's cool hand touched his forehead. Now sleep, Highness. Beric tried to shake his head. How could they not understand? He felt the darkness reach out to drag him down. He had to tell them about the shadow men who swarmed the castle, about the fires. They had been hiding here for years, but now they had come out in full force. Perhaps the family's enemies were only a few chambers away by now. And he also had to tell Bryony about Father. What if he came to her? What if she did not know, did not understand, and let him in? The darkness was pulling, sucking at him, making him liquid. Tell Bryony, he managed, then slid beneath the surface of light once more, down into the burning depths. Young Raymond Beck was finding it hard to think of anything but Helmingsea. They were still 2 days west of Southmarch, and his home lay another 2 days' ride beyond that. But he had been away for a month and a half, and it was hard not to think of his wife and his 2 small boys. Hard to keep his eagerness under control. Easier when we were in Setland, and still weeks away from home, he thought. Easier when we had things to occupy us, bargaining, buying, selling. Now there's nothing left to do but ride and think. He looked ahead along the line of their small caravan, almost a score of high-laden mules and half that many horses, pulling wagons, all under the hand of his cousin Danet Beck, who in turn ruled this mercantile venture on behalf of his father, Raymond's uncle. Danet had made a few mistakes over the past weeks, Raymond thought. Like many untried men, he was quick to take resistance to his authority as a personal slight. But overall, he had not done badly, and the mules and wagons were loaded down with miles of the finest dyed wool thread from Setland, ready for the factories of the March kingdoms. And Raymond himself would benefit from this venture not merely by his own share, which, though tiny, would still bring him more money than he had ever had in his 25 years, enough to leave his parents' house, perhaps, and build his own, but through greater responsibilities in the future, and someday, perhaps, a good-sized share in the family venture. His improving fortunes aside, though, he mostly felt a breathless impatience to see Derla again and hold her close, to see his children and his own father and mother, and to eat bread at his own table. Only a few days, but the wait seemed longer now than it did when the journey had only just begun. We would go faster if we had not combined with that Settish prince's daughter in her party. The girl, scarcely 14, with eyes like a frightened fawn, was being sent to marry Rorik Longarn, Earl of Daler's Trough and a cousin of the Eden family. From what Beck knew of Rorik, it seemed surprising that he would marry at all, let alone a girl of the remote and mountainous eastern lands, but royalty was royalty, it seemed, and any prince's daughter no mean prize. Beck had nothing against the girl, and it was a reassurance even in these fairly peaceful times to have her dozen armored guards riding with the caravan. But she had been frequently ill. At least 3 times, the groups had been forced to stop early for the day because of it, something that had driven homesick Raymond Beck almost to despair. He looked back at the Setlanders, then ahead at the uneven procession of pack mules. One of the drovers saw him looking and waved and pointed at the chinks between the trees and the cloudless autumn sky, as if to say, "Look how lucky we are." The first days of their return journey had been bitter with cold rain off the eastern mountains, so this was indeed a kindly change. He waved back, but in truth he did not much like these forested hills. He remembered them from the outbound trip, how they seemed to loom and lower in the rain, and how they still did even under sunlit skies. Even on a fairly warm day, such as this, they bore their own thick mists along the summit and in the valleys between the slopes. In fact, a tongue of fog seemed to be stretching its way down along the hillside ahead of them, even now, crawling through the trees and across the dark green grass toward the road. Still, it is faster than going by sea, he thought. All that way south, down through the straits and up the eastern coast just to get there. I would have been parted from Darla and the boys for half a year. Someone shouted up ahead. Raymond Beck was startled to see that the tongue of fog had already covered the road at the front of the caravan. Beyond a score of paces, he now could see little except dark tree shadows and the vague outline of men and beasts of burden. He looked up. The sky had swiftly gone dark, as though the mist crept above the trees as well as below. A storm? The shouting was quite loud now, with a strange edge to it. He heard not just confusion or irritation in the men's voices, but real fear. The hairs rose on his neck and arms. An attack? Bandits taking advantage of the sudden fog? He looked for the armored men who escorted the prince's daughter, saw two of them thunder out of the mist and hurtle past him, and realized to his dismay that the fog was behind him now as well. They were all adrift in it like a boat on the ocean. Even as he squinted into the mist, a shape leaped out and his horse reared in terror. Raymond Beck had only a moment to glimpse what had frightened his mount, but that moment was enough to make his heart stumble and almost stop with fright. It was a thing of tatters and cobwebs that flailed at him, pale, long-armed, and eyeless, with a mouth as ragged as a torn sack. His horse reared again and then stumbled as its feet touched the earth. Beck had to cling for his life. Men were screaming all around him now. Horses, too, dreadful shrieks unlike anything he had ever heard. Shapes staggered in and out of the mist, men and other things, grappling, struggling. Some of the voices he had first thought were his companions he now could hear were calling or even singing in some unfamiliar language. More of the tattered things came twitching up out of the brush, but they made up only a small share of the bizarre shapes that danced and gibbered through the mist. Some of the attackers seemed only a little more substantial than the fog itself. Men and horses still screamed, but now the terrible sounds began to grow more faint, as though the mist were thickening into something heavy as stone, or as though Raymond himself had fallen into a hole that was now being filled in atop him. A group of tiny red-eyed shapes, like malevolent, bearded children, leaped out of the grass and clawed at his stirrups. His horse kicked its way through them and bolted in shrilling panic. Branches lashed Raymond Beck's face, but then a heavier limb snatched him completely out of the saddle and flung him to the ground, knocking out his breath and his wits in one blow. He woke, feeling like a sack of broken eggs. For a heart-clutching moment, he saw a face peering down at him from the fog that still swirled all around. A strangely beautiful face, but cold and lifeless as one of the godly statues on a Trigon temple. He held his breath as though he might that way escape the demon's attention, but it only stared at him. Its skin was pale, its eyes shiny as candle flame behind the thick glass of a temple window. He thought it was male, but truly it was hard to think of it as anything so simple and human. Then it was gone, simply vanished, and the fog swirled down around him and turned the world gray. Raymond Beck squeezed his eyes shut and gasped for breath, waiting to die. When he had stayed unmoving long enough to become aware of his aching back and ribs, of the pounding of his head and the countless cuts and scratches on his skin, he opened his eyes once more. The fog was gone. He was in the shade of a deep dell, but he could see bits of blue sky above him through the leaves. He sat up and looked around. The dell was empty. Beck dragged himself to his feet, wincing, but doing his best to remain silent, then crept back along the path of broken branches left by his horse's flight from the road. There was no sign of the horse. There was no noise from any animals or men. Beck braced himself for the terrible scene he knew he would find. He reached the road. A horse, not his own, but one of the caravans, stood there as if waiting for him. Its sides were heaving, but it was otherwise unharmed, cropping grass by the roadside. As he walked toward it, the horse startled a bit, then allowed itself to be stroked. After a moment, it quieted and returned to grazing. Other than this one animal, the road was empty. Of the dozens of men and horses and mules, the wool wagons, the armored soldiers, and the prince's daughter, not to mention whatever army of nightmares had attacked them, no sign remained. Even the fog had vanished. Terror and disbelief squeezed him like a brutal hand. Raymond Beck felt his stomach convulse, then he brought up the remains of his morning meal. He wiped his mouth and clambered hurriedly into the horse's saddle, grunting at the pain in his ribs and back. His companions had disappeared so completely there was nowhere he could think of to begin a search, and in any case he did not want to search, did not want to spend another instant in this haunted spot. He only wanted to ride and ride until he reached a place where people lived. He knew he could never come into these hills again. If that meant he must give up his place in the family venture and his wife and children must join him begging for coppers in the street, there was no help for it. He kicked his heels against his new mount's ribs and started east, huddled low against the horse's neck and weeping. It was early in the morning, and she couldn't sleep, had not slept all night, despite immense weariness. Bryony lay in her bed staring into the darkness, listening to the slumber sounds of Rose and Moina and 3 other young noblewomen who were staying in the castle on this night before Fred Kendrick's funeral. How could any of them sleep, she wondered. Did they not know that everything was in danger? That the entire kingdom tottered? If Shazo was the murderer and had acted alone, there could be no comprehensible reason for it. And so how could she trust anyone ever again? If somehow he had been suborned, or if someone else performed this terrible murder and painted him with the blame, then the Eddens had been purposefully struck to the heart by a terrible enemy, and struck as they slept in their own house. How could anyone ever sleep again? Her heart had begun beating swiftly even before she realized what the new sound was, a quiet knock at the door of her chamber. There were guards outside, she knew. Even that careless fool Ferris Vanson would not leave her unguarded at a time like this. She pulled a cloak over her nightdress. The room and the stone floors were cold, and started toward the door. But Kendrick had guards, she remembered, and her skin took a deeper chill. He would have thought he was safe, too. Princess? The voice was quiet, but she recognized it. Now she was frightened for a completely different reason. She hurried forward, hesitated again for a moment. Chavin? It is you? Truly you? It is. We are here too, Highness. It was one of the guards. She recognized the gruff voice, although she couldn't remember the man's name. You can open the door. Still, Such had been the terror of the last days that she had to force herself not to flinch when the door at last swung open. Chavin and the guard stood waiting in the pool of torchlight outside. The physician's face was serious and haggard with exhaustion, but the terrible look she expected to see was not there. "Is it my brother?" "It is, my lady, but do not fear. I come to say I think his fever has broken. He will not quickly be himself again, but I strongly believe he will live and recover. He was asking for you." "Merciful Zoria! Thank all the gods!" Bryony fell to her knees and lowered her head in prayer. She should have been delirious with joy, but instead she was suddenly dizzy. This one terrible fear allayed. It was as though the rigor with which she had held herself up now this one terrible fear allayed. It was as though the rigor with which she had held herself up now ended in a moment. She tried to stand, but instead swayed and began to collapse. Chavin and one of the guards caught at her arms. "We will survive," she whispered. "Yes, princess," he said, "but tonight you will go back to bed." "But Beric," the room still spun around her. "I will tell him that you will come with the first light. He is probably asleep now anyway." "Tell him I love him, Chavin." "I will." She allowed herself to be helped onto her own bed. For a moment she could not avoid thinking of poor Kendrick in the hands of the death maids of Cernios at this very moment. But even this horror, or the walls that seemed slowly to revolve, could not keep exhaustion at bay. Tell Beric," she said. "Tell Beric." But that was all she could manage before weariness finally breached the stronghold and conquered her. And I think that's where we're going to end, because that's the end of the chapter. And we will start a new chapter next time. Chapter 11, Bride of the God. Bride of the God. Very, very, sounds like a very bad 50s movie. Bride of the God. Anyway, so that's it for tonight, or for this whole weekend, actually, since this is the second of the two readings. And I wish to say to you all, it's a great honor, I guess, for lack of a better word, that people care enough to show up. And I'm glad to see you. I'm glad to stay in touch with you. And I hope that you all continue to treat yourself and your loved ones well. We are doing our best around here. We are hoping that things have turned the corner, at least in the pandemic and the things that revolve around the pandemic. Obviously, the world is a big place. There's a lot of other stuff still to be worried about and concerned about. Very worried, very concerned. But, we have to be well before we can fix things. So I hope we are all continuing on toward wellness. Now, there's another movie film. I'm not sure I'd go see that one either. On toward wellness. But that's enough to say that I am going to check out now. We're almost at 8 o'clock. I hope you all will be back with me when I next read, which of course is going to be next Sunday at 2 a.m. my time, Pacific Daylight Time? Standard Time. Daylight. I can't remember. I'm always forgetting this. And unless one of my friends is around to tell me, I don't know what is what and which is which. But that's okay. I've built an entire lifestyle out of having people explain to me what I should remember on my own. Anyway, and I've also said anyway about 14 times, which is also another measure of fatigue. With that, I am going to bid you all adieu. Those of you who want to keep up and can't always attend the readings, of course you can find them here on Facebook, on Twitter, on tadwilliams.com, which has a lovely message board where those of you who have not been yet would find lots of other nice people, many of whom are signing in each time and saying hello to each other and to all of you. So if you're looking for a bunch of people to hang out with who are really nice people, and they don't just talk about my work all the time, because God knows there's other things in the world to think about. But those are really nice people, and they're on tadwilliams.com on the message board. And then, of course, Chris has been putting up the readings on YouTube as well. So that's another place you can find them. Basically, the world is absolutely rotten with different vestiges of Taddism. So it's actually harder to escape it than it is to find it. So with that thought, and with my last gooey remarks still clinging to you, and they won't come off without a good washing, I say good night, and good afternoon, and good morning, depending on where you are. But for me, good evening from California. Hope you're all going to have a good week in the week ahead, and I will see